into the discussion. For now, I'd love to welcome the chair of the session, Mr. Moussa Oumarou, who's the Deputy Director General here at the ILO, responsible for field operations and partnerships. Let's give him a round of applause as he comes up. And I'm going to invite Mr. Oumarou very shortly, because he's going to, you may take a seat, sir. He has a very important role today, and that is to kick off this conversation by giving us an overview of the global social protection situation and bringing our attention to the ILO's two-dimensional strategy of achieving SDG 1.3 as well as universal social protection. You can take your seats and we'll have your intervention in a second, but thank you for being here, and we look forward to the context that you're going to set for us. We also have with us, ladies and gentlemen, Mr. Iván Rico López. He is an international director at the Ministry of Wellbeing from Mexico. Welcome, sir. Thank you so much for being here. Mr. López, you can take your seat there. I'd also like to invite Madame Cecilia Mbaka. Madame Mbaka is the head of National Social Protection Secretariat in Kenya. Thank you very much, Madame, for being here. We appreciate it. Let's give her a round of applause. Thank you, Madame Mbaka, and you can take a seat on the other side of Mr. Oumarou. We also have, ladies and gentlemen, Madame Francisca Jiménez. She's the Vice President of the CACC Dominican Republic and Vice President of TUCA. Yes, we can give her a round of applause as well. Thank you very much, Madame, and you can take a seat right here on this seat. Thank you very much. I appreciate it. Ladies and gentlemen, in our presence as well is Madame Giovanna Prialé. She is a member of the National Confederation of Private Business Associations, as well as a president of the Association of Private Pension Funds Administrators in Peru. Thank you very much for being here, Madame. And last but certainly not least, it's a great pleasure for me to invite Madame Mirai Chatterjee. She's a director for the Self-Employed Women's Organization in India. Welcome, Madame. Thank you very much. And may I invite you to take a seat at the far end next to Madame Prialé. Thank you very much. Now, ladies and gentlemen, as we prepare for this panel discussion, I'd love to set the context and then invite Mr. Oumarou to give us a greater contextualization from an ILO perspective. We have to recognize that although we've seen significant progress throughout the world, and we've heard this in terms of the presentations that were made earlier, that social security as a human right is still not a reality for every single person around the world. In fact, the numbers actually show a very startling picture. The numbers tell us that 29% of the global population has access to comprehensive social security systems. That's only 29%. That's less than a third of the world. But we also know that 45% of the global population are covered by at least one social protection benefit. And the startling number that brings this conversation into sharp focus is the reality of that 55% of the world is still completely unprotected. Simply put, this means 4 billion individuals today have to deal with risks that can arise over their life cycle on their own with no protection whatsoever. And so the panelists that are here with us this afternoon are going to be sharing their very specific challenges that they have faced in their endeavor to extend social protection to all. In addition to that, they're going to be sharing some examples where they have been successful and giving us a little bit of insights around what has actually led to that success. But most importantly, they're also going to critically reflect on what is still needed if we're really going to close the coverage gaps and achieve universal social protection by 2030. And so to kick us off, I'm going to invite Mr. Oumarou to give us the context and an overview of the global social protection landscape around the world, and to surface for us once again the two-dimensional strategy to achieve SDG 1.3 and universal social protection of the ILO. I hand over to you, sir. So our microphones just take 2 to 3 seconds, and then you can go.
Merci, Madame.
Thank you, Madam. Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, ministers, representatives of governments, of organizations of workers and employers, and representatives of the civil society, university people and researchers, Friends of the United Nations, my dear colleagues. It is an honor for me to be here today with you at this room in this 100-year-old beautiful institution, International Labour Organization, so to celebrate its centenary of social protection. Within the International Labour Organization. 100 years, that means you wonder, what was the situation previously? I don't see very many 100-year-old people in this room, so no one can give us a first-hand perception regarding the situation of social protection. But we can say that 100 years ago, the time of our grandparents, great-grandparents, there was no social protection because we had to wait till 1948 for us to be able to talk about this as being a human right. And at that time, we can also say that generally, human beings died young because they had no access to health care. They had no well-deserved retirement, and even less did they have unemployment insurance or maternity leave.
Let's get assistance for the translation for Madame Mbaka. The translation set she has is not working. Thank you very much, sir. If you could assist us very quickly so that she's not left behind in the conversation.
Can you hear interpretation?
I do believe that you would want all of us to hear your very valid contribution.
Merci infiniment. Je voudrais...
Thank you very much. I would like to be heard by the guests who are in this room. So, can you hear? Can you hear us now? Wonderful. As I said, at the time, what we knew about before this issue of social protection were a human right, that people did not benefit from health care. They had no retirement, and even less that they have unemployment insurance or maternity leave. So what has happened since then? What has been the progress made? After the first measures undertaken in a certain number of countries, they were pioneer countries, the world witnessed a social protection system. They saw it proliferate. Social protection systems were set up, which were unequal in importance and in quality throughout the world. So let me see where I am. With the implementation of these protection systems throughout the world meant that today, the time we were talking about, that all the countries of the world, there was at least a social protection, a legal one, which is provided to the citizens of that country. But the question that we wonder about, which is a huge question that we'll have to answer, is to know, does this mean that everyone benefits from social protection today? Madam Moderator, you've already begun to give us some figures, so allow me to repeat them and to complete them. Unfortunately not, still not. There is no social protection for everyone throughout the world. The International Labour Organization feels that or is estimated at the world scale that 1 person out of 2 has no social protection. More specifically, we know today that 6 families out of 10 have no family allowances. More than 7 employees out of 10 receive no unemployment benefits. Out of 6 mothers out of 10 receive no maternity benefits. And almost 3 people, elderly people out of 10, have no access to retirement pension. And then to finish drawing up this picture, you must know that 4 people out of 10 have no access to essential health services. These figures, or this picture that I've just drawn, which seems rather dark and somber, is alarming. The second question we can ask ourselves, or that we should ask ourselves, is this what we want today? Do we want this picture that I have just outlined? Is that what we want for the world? Is that what we want for man? Man in the broad sense, so with a capital M. My answer, and I'm sure all the participants in this room, and even beyond this room, the answer is no. It is not this picture that we want. This is not the world we want. So this means that we have a moral obligation, but also a political obligation, and also economic, to do everything to change the situation that I have just described previously. But for this to occur, we must change our mindset. We have to change it, and I think, if I've understood this properly, what I was told, and that is what the Deputy Secretary General of the United Nations, Amina Mohamed, spoke of when she talked to you today through a video. So we should have the conviction, that is ourselves, and in this room and out of this room, and here, and I'm sure that in this room, this is something which is acquired, the conviction that you all have, but we have to convince the leaders of the world. We also have to convince all the stakeholders that social protection is not a cost. Social protection is not something which is expensive. Social protection is an investment in, first of all, in human beings. It's investment in peace, or for peace, social peace, an investment in social justice and economic development. What we see today, what is happening throughout the world, and which is not just a characteristic of one region of the world. It applies to all continents, with everything that we think about, what we've seen happens in the streets as a protest against social measures or about social measures. We know it's not a cost, it's an investment. So the next question is, what will tomorrow's social protection look like? Since that of today is obviously is not as satisfactory for everyone. Tomorrow, as soon as we're talking about the future, it's difficult to foresee it, but we can say that we have a global agenda, which is the 2030 agenda, that is SDGs, Sustainable Development Goals, and this agenda, as the moderator said previously, we have SDG 1.3, which recommends that all the stakeholders should create national protection systems, and including social protection floors, which enables us in this way to cover the whole population. So it's crystal clear that tomorrow's social protection will be universal. And it won't just be a few scattered systems here and there, but coherent systems which wish to cover the whole world. We know that this year the member states of the ILO have adopted the Centenary Declaration for the Future of Work. The ILO Centenary Declaration for the Future of Work. And this declaration provides also guidelines on tomorrow's social protection. This provides these guidelines. It encourages our constituents to build social protection systems which are universal, providing an adequate protection. Universality is not enough. We needed to have proper, adequate protection. These systems must be sustainable. In other words, the fact that these systems can resist the different constraints, as systems which can allow us to be a long-term system, that is essential. So these are sustainable systems. They have to be sustainable. They have to be based on solid financial foundations and based on social dialogue. And for this system to be sustainable and be on solid foundations and sustainable foundations so they can ensure the sustainability of their financing, this will have to go through social dialogue. You are here in the room, and you're representing social dialogue. Being seated here, I see the three constituents of social dialogues of the ILO: the governments, the employers, to my right, and the employers and the workers. So these systems have to be adapted to new requirements and respond to new risks that the present and the future have in store for us. I must also say that the world today abounds in experiences, plentiful in experience, and the experience we have around us in this room should enable us to create sources of inspiration for all the stakeholders and to see to it that there where we thought it was impossible to establish a social protection system, that has been done and can be done elsewhere. And there where the social protection system was the object of a reform, and a reform which is accepted, a reform which enables us to guarantee sustainability, that this be a source of inspiration in our discussions and what we will do afterwards at the end of this meeting, so that finally the Sustainable Development Goals by 2030 can be reached, attained. Well, Madam Moderator, these are a few words that I wanted to say here within this room.
Very much, Mr. Oumarou, and I think you've done a brilliant job of raising the key issues. We can give him a round of applause. I think someone wants to give him a round of applause. You've done a fantastic job of raising the two big questions that we need to grapple with. The first is this the world we want? When we begin to look at what the stats tell us today about the 55% that are completely unprotected, is this the world we want? And then you raise a second question, and that is, what do we want social protection to look like tomorrow? And in raising those questions, you've put agency back in our hands, because this is a matter of will, a matter of collaboration, and a matter of action. So thank you very much for sharing that with us and for laying that context. I must say, when you started, you said that nobody in this room looks like they've been around for 100 years. Well, I'm not sure. There's one or two that look like they've been around for 100 years. I'm just teasing. So let's do this. Let's get into our panel discussion. And I want to start off by going to Mexico. Mr. Rico, in Mexico, we know that there is a tax-financed universal pension scheme that will soon reach its goal of 8.4 million beneficiaries, which is a very, very big number. And this is a universal pension scheme that is one of the largest that have been created within years. Could you please share with us the social protection situation in Mexico, the main challenges that have been faced in terms of reducing the coverage gap, and also how this scheme is changing the lives of people in practice?
Sí. Gracias.
Thank you. I'm going to answer in French. I'm going to answer the questions in Spanish. Listen very carefully, and I was very happy to listen to Mr. Oumarou, particularly his four main points. The first is the world picture, which is rather discouraging in terms of coverage of social protection. That same picture, we find ourselves about a year ago, where we've assumed a new government, or took over the new government in Mexico. And this brings us to the second point of social protection, is investment for social peace and not an expense. The same situation is in Mexico. When we talk about public expenditures, we talk about public investment to restore peace, social peace. The third point, social protection of the future, is universal. Specifically, the policy of well-being of Mexico right now is addressing the universality of all these social programs. The fourth point and last point is sustainable systems in time. Now, specifically, now that we already have a year implementing the social programs in Mexico, what we're seeking to do is to bring up the constitutional ranks, in other words, establishing Mexican laws, establish in those laws something which makes it mandatory to continue providing these social protection advantages to the whole population. And as far as these questions go, I would like to answer. For the first time in Mexico, we have a universal pay-as-you-go system to take care of the elderly. For the first time in Mexico, we've set up a social program of such a magnitude that there are 8.5 million people, adults and elderly, which we think will receive the benefits of this universal pay-as-you-go system. Now, what happens in Mexico? A year ago, we had a new government, and in Mexico, there was a regressive system of Social Security in which most of the government subsidies went towards the capitalization system. In other words, people who contributed from the formal economy, formal employment, and they contributed to retirement. And that's about 30% of the population. Now we realize that this 70% of the population, which was not covered, only received about 14% of the public subsidy for their pensions. So, faced with this scenario, which is discouraging, alarming, and a general situation of in Mexico of high poverty and inequality, we decided to undertake a universal program, pay-as-you-go program for the people of age. So we have a 40% of coverage, and by the end of the year, we'll be able to reach 100%. We'll be able to reach almost 8.5 adult of age people and elderly. And by the next year, we've already approved the budget with which we have an increase of 3% to be able to take care of the inflation percentages. And it's a high, and this way we don't go against the purchasing power of the people. And how has this benefited the adult of age people? Well, at this stage, we still don't have the necessary official measurements carried out by the National Council to carry this out throughout the country. But we do have results of previous programs which modified and improved because of three factors: the life of these adult people, and second is firstly that's the food. They received more proteins in their health studies. Secondly, the housing. With these resources able to improve their houses. And the third issue was their health. They had better capacities to buy medication and take care of their diseases because of their age. Thank you.
Very much, Mr. Rico. And again, I appreciate how you've gone back to reinforce this distinction between cost and investment, which is what Mr. Oumarou started us off with, that mindset shift for us to change the narrative from cost to investment and calling it a public investment for social peace, I think is a very important phraseology that you've introduced for us. And also the number of firsts that have been achieved, and as you move towards 100% of your universal coverage, the official returns of investments that are being manifested in the existence and increase in life, in food, in housing, and in health. So thank you for that Mexican example. I would love to move on to the continent of Africa, to go to East Africa in particular, and go to you, Madame Mbaka, because we know that Kenya has dedicated itself to providing universal social protection to older persons. And you particularly have been concerned about the protection of older women who work mainly in rural and informal economies. Could you share with us, firstly, some of the insights from the Inua Jamii scheme that has been implemented, and how have you made sure, secondly, that it really is reaching elderly people in the rural areas?
Thank you. The Older Persons Cash Transfer Program in Kenya is one of the 4 cash transfer programs that we have in Kenya. And the Inua Jamii program that the moderator is talking about is a Kiswahili word which means uplifting families. And It is the biggest program in Kenya in terms of numbers and in terms of the resources that have been allocated to it. It is a universal program, and it's spread out in all the counties of Kenya. And majority of the beneficiaries are in the rural areas, considering that Kenya is basically a rural population with about 73% of the rural population living in Kenya. The program is currently reaching about 833,129 out of 942,314 persons who are aged 70 years and above, which means it is reaching about 88% of persons who are aged 70 and above, and that means only 12% are not being reached. And that is as per the census report, which we did just recently in the month of August this year. The current budget allocation is about US dollars 203 million, and it is all taxed finance, so it is financed by the government of Kenya with no donor support. So how are we making sure that the program effectively reaches the rural people? Now, one of the things that we have done is to improve on the institutional framework. Mm-hmm. Until 2016, the cash transfer programs in Kenya were run by different departments with a lot of duplication and high overhead costs. Yeah. But we consolidated these programs in 2016 so that they are now running under one roof, which makes it more efficient. The other thing that we have done is to develop an operations manual so that the activities of the program are not done in an ad hoc way. Yeah. We know how they are supposed to be done, which increases efficiency and effectiveness with the way we are delivering the programs. The other thing that we have done is to make some reforms on payments. Mm-hmm. Previously, the Inua Jamii program was delivered through the Post Bank of Kenya, just one bank. And we had a lot of challenges, which included poor access to pay points, high literacy levels, lack of identification documents, staff terrains, among others. So in 2018, we decided to make some reforms, and we contracted 4 banks to deliver the cash transfers to the beneficiaries, who included the elderly persons. And this was based, and the model of hiring the 4 banks was based on a number of, was based on a certain rationale. We wanted to give them a choice of who should deliver the money to them. We also were looking for issues of flexibility. They can move from one bank to the other if they feel that one bank is not really serving them. We also wanted to handle issues of affordability, issues of financial inclusion, where you are giving beneficiaries a chance to have a bank account like you and me. We were also looking at timely payments. Previously, the beneficiaries could go for a long time without the payments. Yep. We were also looking at having 2-factor authentication for identification, which included the national identity and the biometric. And we were looking at proximity to pay points, among others. So the accounts that the beneficiaries were opening had certain features which made accessibility easier. Yeah. And one of them was that there are no monthly fees for the accounts, which makes it quite easy to operate for the kind of beneficiaries that we are dealing with. They are also allowed 2 free withdrawals per cycle, which gives them an opportunity to save. Yeah. If there is a bumper harvest and they don't need all the money, then they can make the savings to use the money for something else. The card that they are given is a debit card, and it is also mobile enabled. It also gives the beneficiaries an opportunity to switch from one service provider. If they feel one bank is not serving them well, after 1 year they can change to another bank among the 4 that have been contracted. When the older persons are being registered, they are given an opportunity to identify a caretaker, so that in case they are ailing or they cannot be able to access their money, then they can use the caregiver. We also have a grievance and complaint mechanism that allows them to call a free toll number, 1533, so that in case they have any difficulties, then they can be addressed, either at the local level or they can accelerate to the national level. The other thing we have done is to develop a management information system to make sure that everyone counts and to also enable us to know who is receiving the money, who is not receiving at any one time. Thank you.
Madam, thank you very much. So I just want to tie this back to some of the comments that were made by Mr. López in the earlier session. He spoke about systems that are well designed and efficient. And some of the principles that you've shared with us speak directly to that. You've spoken about reviewing the institutional framework so that you are moving towards good design and efficiency, making sure that there's an operating manual, focusing on payments and making that easier, and of course bringing on 4 banks to be able to allow the benefits to reach the intended beneficiaries. But I suspect that the additional point that you've made, and I think which is critical, is the human-centeredness of this particular approach. You have spoken to a number of themes that speak to how you've put these elderly women in rural areas at the center of how you have designed this system, from choice to flexibility to affordability to financial inclusion to timely payment, security, and even proximity. So what we're asking, ladies and gentlemen, is, as Director General Guy Ryder said, the conversations might be messy, but the linkages are beginning to be visible irrespective of where we are in the country and the case studies that we're looking at. So let me stay with the theme of women, because I think the theme of women is quite important. And I'd love to come to you, Madam Chatterjee, on the theme of women, because we know that women are particularly vulnerable when it comes to social protection coverage. And maybe allow me to turn the question on its head a little bit. How can social protection be a means of advancing gender equality?
Thanks very much, Sister Nozipo, and delighted to be here representing SEVA, which is the national union of 1.7 million women workers in the informal economy. We have been struggling for social protection for almost 50 years now, and I'm happy to say there has been some forward movement. Coming to your question immediately, in most societies, and certainly in India, our society is still deeply patriarchal. There again has been some forward movement thanks to the women's movement in India and also the labor and cooperative movements, but we still have a long way to go. How can social protection be a means to advance gender equality, you ask me, Sister Nozipo? And I think that it's a good place to start. It's a logical place to start in any society. If we are serious about including all, each and every person, why not start with those who are the most discriminated, the most vulnerable, and the most excluded, which is the women workers of our country, particularly those in the vast informal economy, which in our case is more than 95% of the entire female workforce. And women in our country, and I suspect in many other countries, suffer from the triple discrimination of being poor, informal, women in patriarchal societies, and in countries like mine, also disproportionately belonging to disadvantaged communities, social groups, and castes. So for all these reasons, it's a good place to start. And since we are also celebrating 150 years of Mahatma Gandhi's birthday, I'd like to remind us all of what he said. Whenever in doubt, whenever contemplating any action, think of the poorest, the most excluded, and the most vulnerable, and you will never go wrong. So all those are good reasons to start with women. The other second reason is that for us, social protection is survival. It's about survival. It's about, of course, correcting deep inequities and historical injustices to women of the world, and in this case, I'm speaking about India, but it helps us survive. With social protection, for example, if we have healthcare, access to medicines, some of the services that my sister from Kenya mentioned, then we don't need to use our hard-earned daily wages and income, you know, and there aren't those kinds of leakages. So therefore, it's survival. If we have childcare, then we can go out to work and earn and feed our families. That's why I say it is survival. It's no luxury at all. And I think we'd all agree there can be no economic empowerment and equality of women in all of our countries without basic social protection. So that's another reason. Our own experience is that when social protection, the kind of identity cards you mentioned, when cards are put in the names of women, when policies, insurance policies are taken out in the name of women, then the gender balance in the family, in the power dynamics in the family change, and we move slowly and steadily towards gender equality. Two other quick points, actually only one more quick point, which is that social protection is good for organizing women. So those of us who are organizing women into unions and cooperatives, social protection is a very good way to rally women, to bring women together, build a solidarity and sisterhood, and preferably through their own social protection cooperatives. So we don't always depend on our governments, which may or may not implement. And I think that itself is empowering.
Yeah.
The fact that we run our own, it builds women's leadership, and it leads us steadily towards the road to women's equality. So it's a slow and steady process, no doubt, but social protection, we have found, can be a powerful tool to organize women and communities.
Thank you very much, Madam Chatterjee. You remind me of the words of State Secretary Saila Ruth this morning, when she reminded us that maybe we've got the saying wrong, that a woman's best friend isn't actually diamonds, but maybe it is social welfare or social protection in this particular regard. And I'm particularly moved by your statement that when you put the card and the policy in the name of the woman, and you put the woman's name on those cards, on that policies, it is the equivalent of putting power in the hands of women. And I think that's a pretty cool and very, very important insight that you've left with us today. We don't just wake up with patriarchal societies being dismantled. We have to be deliberate about how we do that. And social protection is just one of the ways of doing that. You've made a good point and a couple of really good points around the most vulnerable. And so on that note of the most vulnerable, I'd like to come to Madame Jiménez. Because, Madame, we know that if we look at the Dominican Republic as an example, and in particular where we look at AMUSO, which is a trade union, a supported association that facilitates access to public social insurance schemes for self-employed workers and other categories of vulnerable workers. Maybe you could give us, firstly, a brief explanation on how it all works, on how AMUSO works, and how many people who were previously excluded from social protection now have access to social protection because of the scheme.
Muchas gracias. Yo también quiero sumarme.
Thank you. I would like to thank, like everybody else did, the organisers for inviting me to this subject of great interest to us all. First of all, I'd like to emphasize that in the Dominican Republic, as in other countries, there is a law on social security, and it is universal. But the great difference is that it remains on paper. It's a dead letter. It's not applied in practice. Today we have more than 18 years have passed since the start of a social security system, but more than 50% of the population is excluded from any coverage. And here we come to the subject of workers, and particularly women workers, in significant numbers, who work in the informal economy. Informal jobs are mostly held by women because we have more difficulties in accessing a job. And so we have to be self-employed. And so women who are mothers They have to go out to work to maintain the family. So our law is universal, but today it applies only to part of the population. Statistics say that more than 50% of the working population has no formal job. So those people are in the informal sector of the economy. I'm saying this so as to explain why the trades unions thought that their contribution had to be significant in order to lead to a more fair and just society, the one to which we all aspire. And that is where we set up AMUSOL, which was at the initiative of the trade unions, to promote social protection and to try to find some way of enabling self-employed women in the informal economy to receive social security benefits. So AMUSOL is, as an association, it's legally set up. And the first thing we do to promote the benefits offered by the system to workers and their families. And this motivates people to find out what we do, who we are, and join so that they can have social security. The main thing that AMUSOL does is give guidance to the system, to people, and give guidance on workers' rights so that they can have social security as a labor right. So we inform people, we educate them, we have seminars and workshops so that we can be a permanent assistance to our affiliates. So, and we also send out news to the affiliates about the system. It works as a virtual employer too. That's what we do. It also collects money to help individual organizations, but also groups or associations that are affiliated. And we pay contributions to the Social Security Fund. So AMUSOL, we could say, taking all this into consideration, has not been something easy in which the trade unions have got involved. But as time has passed, we've been proved right. And that is that if we want to, we can make a contribution. Now we have more than 86,000 affiliates affiliated to the Social Security through this association. And there's no doubt that these workers, whereas in the past they had no type of social security coverage at all, and a very limited access to the state services, now do or can benefit from the benefits that the system offers. As regards pensions, family, health insurance, and also occupational accident insurance. One important point I'd like to make is that all these services are very important, but AMUSOL is not there to keep people in the informal sector. We are making our contribution to the program of transition towards the formal economy, and we therefore give guidance to groups on the subject. And there are more than 75,000 micro and small companies that have been set up.
Very, very strong inputs that you've shared with us. And I suppose one of them is a word of caution for all of us to think about as we set up policy reforms and tap into legislation to help us move towards universal social protection, that we're not producing, and I quote your words, pieces of paper that are dead letters. And that we're really thinking critically about the people that are supposed to be at the center of these policies and legislations. Because it's only when we engage with the reality of those people that we can make a tangible contribution in their lives. But you've landed on a very important point, and this idea of informality and the transition to formality, and whether social protection can play a role in that or not. And so I'd like to bring that to you, Madame Prialé, because we know that more than 60% of the global workforce is in informal employment, and the large majority of these people in informal employment are facing very serious work gaps, including, of course, a lack of social security. We know that many countries have also taken steps to facilitate the registration of micro and small companies in order to promote formalization, including Peru as a specific example. The question to you is this: could you share with us some insights around how Peru has removed barriers to social security for business owners in particular?
Buenas tardes a todos.
Good afternoon, everyone. I'm going to speak Spanish. Thank you very much for inviting me. Yes, I think that this is a wonderful opportunity to exchange experiences and find the opportunities that we're all looking for. I think that one of the most important subjects today is perhaps the first time I've heard this, although I've been in social protection for years, that we're going to see social security as an investment, or social protection as investment. I think this will lead to a different mindset in our countries, especially as regards costs, because at the heart of social protection is the citizen. I'd like to briefly say that in Peru, which is where I come from, there's been a growth in economic growth over the last 20 years. In spite of this growth, we are still a medium-income country. We have a per capita income of about $600 a year. 70% of the population is still in the informal economy. So there are people working today. Out of 10 people, 3 have social protection, but 7 don't. They have no access to social protection. But the most important thing is the following. Small companies represent 96% of companies in Peru and employ 75% of the labor force. So my first thought would be is that economic growth per se doesn't guarantee maintaining small companies, and it doesn't allow them to provide social protection for their workers. So in Peru, we have thought about this, and I'll tell you what we've decided. Employers and the state are involved in social protection. We have a social reform going on of social protection, but we need the 3 parties. We need the state, which has to be sustainable, the employer, who has a fundamental role to play, and the worker, who has to be the center of the social protection reform. And to reply to your question, yes, achieving the formalization of companies has gone through several stages. First of all, you need the normative framework. Normative framework has to be positive, but transform itself over time. When we started work on developing SMEs, that was back in 2013, but we've been changing things over time to involve more state funding. We have 2 important banks, the Agro Bank and the National Bank. So we've made access easier for people with low income and people in the rural economy. So this can involve exempting people from paying tax, So we have to have, on the one hand, finance to help these companies grow, and on the other hand, state help. For the first time in the history of our country, this year, the President of the Republic said that social protection coverage was a universal right, and that health coverage should be for all workers, whether they are independent workers or self-employed or in the informal or the formal economy. And then there's the second right that's been recognized, access to pensions. But how to achieve that pension coverage is universal as well? We still have to do that. So the way is long, but as the first step, we need a normative framework to design adequate laws, but they has to be able to evolve over time, depending on how the market grows. And the second important point is about financing. I know this fairly well. In Peru, the microfinance market was designed first and foremost for the private sector. It was going to be developed in the microfinance companies, which would give credit to micro companies. And the upshot of all that is that in Peru, micro companies do have access to credit, low interest rates throughout the country. So we have managed to democratize credit. That's very important. And it's been considered as a reference because it's a good way of providing microcredit. This has been tried in Mexico and Egypt and the Middle East as well, because these microfinance companies are regulated. It depends rather on the market to which they're aimed. Their work is very important because somebody that provides credit the person providing the credit, they go to the field, to the rural economy, for example, see how the cash flow is working, and they also give credit, but they also collect the money that's owing. This leads to a growth in micro and small enterprises and brings in the credit, which is very important if they're to continue working. And the third point, the need for the micro enterprises to get onto the market. They're very small, so it's difficult for them to export, for example, abroad. And they need to be mentored or given a structure by the larger enterprises so that they can also sell to the state as the main provider. And a month ago, the National Confederation of Private Enterprises included the directors into the put him on the board of the Micro Enterprises Federation. So it's through joint work that the micro enterprises are going to be able to export, helped by the big companies. So these briefly are the very quick comments that I wanted to make. This is a very important discussion that we are having. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Madame Prialé, for bringing the sharp focus onto small and medium-sized enterprises, in particular sharing some very practical examples about how we can think innovatively about how do we support small and medium-sized enterprises to not be left behind in the provision of social protection in the context of moving from informalization to formalization. Now, ladies and gentlemen, I'm very anxious that we get your voice into these conversations. I know that my colleagues on that side of the room are holding some pieces of paper that have some questions that you want to bring into this conversation. So I'm going to ask you to collectively help me put my panelists under pressure. And what I'm going to ask is that I'm going to fire off one more round of questions to my panelists, but I'm going to ask them to be very brief, very concise, very much to the point, so I can get your voice into the conversation. So I'm asking you to help me put pressure on them together. So, Mr. Oumarou, let's get you setting the new pace for us in this conversation. We've had some really beautiful, insightful, and robust contributions. Why is tripartite action important in order for us to fulfill the right to social security and to close the existing coverage gap? Why do we need tripartite action? Very briefly.
Merci, Madame la Modératrice.
Thank you, Mrs. Moderator. If there's one word that is underscored and accepted by everyone in this room, and that is, particularly during the governing body sessions, is tripartism. Tripartism, I'm not going to define it here, but I think that everyone knows what's at stake. We can just say that, first of all, it's a configuration of social-politic forces to be able to reach a result. Tripartism is a way of governance, and this mode of governance which facilitates social dialogues amongst the governments, the representatives of the workers and employers' organizations. On this whole issue of social protection, why do we need to have this social dialogue, which is tripartite? And because the state has its regulator's role, it has to ensure everyone's well-being, but the employers and workers' organizations have their say, particularly in the field of social protection. I see two essential reasons for this. One is that it's up to the workers and employers to see and detect what the risks are, priority risks, and that should be covered. And the second thing is to see, as employers and workers, see what kind of protection should be made. And that is one of the first reasons, and it's just as important, and it can only be done within the framework of social dialogue. The second aspect of this social protection dialogue is the fact that the workers in the systems which we call the capitalization system, employer-worker, both contribute. And here, they're allowed to express themselves, and then we have to know how to ensure everyone's protection on the basis of what has been done. And even in systems which are not capitalization systems, it's with the taxes of the citizens, that is workers and employers, that this system is financed. So they do have something to say as well. And this will mean that the importance of social dialogues as far as social protection is concerned, and it doesn't have to be demonstrated. You all know that often the very management of these bodies, social protection bodies, and is done jointly in this institution. And you all know that as regards social protection, and it's there in the social dialogue and social protection bodies, that's where you have the social dialogue that you find just about everywhere, and without talking about a country in particular. So that's the importance here when we're talking about social dialogue. And without social dialogue, we cannot have a social protection system which is sustainable. I said it previously when I was in my introductory remarks. Without social dialogues, we cannot reform either, because there's an evolution in the situation of different countries. And at some point in time in history, reform is essential. But this reform, for it to be able to be a good reform accepted by all, it has to be through social dialogue.
Very much. So again, underscoring the importance of dialogue, and that can't take place outside of tripartite action. Mirai, I believe you've got the voice of the audience in your hands. Won't you please bring me the voice of the audience? Ladies and gentlemen, I don't think we're putting enough pressure on this panel to really give us the pace that we're looking for. So I'm going to take, thank you very much. So I'm going to take these. I'm going to make you a promise that I'm going to bring this conversation in. But before we do that, and Madame Chatterjee, I hope you're going to set the pace for us. There is a group that we haven't spoken about, and that is children. And so if we look at these stats, 2 out of 3 children are not covered by any social protection benefit. Can you just share with us briefly why child benefits as well as child care facilities are so important, especially in the context of India? And also whether you have seen any successful examples of the extension of social protection to families with children.
Thanks a lot, Sister Nozipo. I'll keep my remarks mainly to child care because there's not much, unfortunately, to say on child benefits. We long to have the kind of child benefits that are available in your country. I think the first comment I'd like to make, and I'm envious of those countries which have universal protection, social protection, is that child care in our country is not universal. It is not according to the reality of informal workers who go out to the fields or the forests or the marketplaces early in the morning and come home late at night. We do have a daycare program, which is supposed to be the world's largest because, well, we are a large country with a big population. It's called the Integrated Child Development Scheme, but it's not full-day child care. It's not according to the hours of informal workers. So those are our major limitations. And what we have found about child care and child care services is that it breaks the intergenerational cycle of deprivation and exclusion from social protection. So I'm talking about full-day child care in the early years, or what's often called the first 1,000 days, for 0 to 6-year-old children, essential for children of the working poor and their working parents, most of whom are in the informal economy. And our experience is that this kind of holistic childcare is not just good for children, it also bucks malnutrition, which in a country like ours has still 1/3 of our children are stunted and wasted. But also it's good for working women. Coming back to women, it increases women's workforce participation. This is something we hear again and again. Our own small micro studies have shown that women's incomes go up at least 50% and usually double just from this provision of social protection. And so she can bring essentials like food and medicines into the home. And another quick point I'd like to make is that we found from our micro studies that for the first time, in fact, 70% of the older siblings went to school for the first time once there was childcare. So childcare is not just a nice service, it's an essential economic input and social protection. And actually we are in the forefront of a campaign, a national and global campaign on publicly funded quality childcare for all.
Childcare is not a nice to have. It is a critical tool to break intergenerational poverty. Thank you. That was a really, really powerful point. And again, if we think about that number you've shared with us, where there has been childcare, at least 70% of firstborns in their generation get to go to school. That is absolutely life-changing for many. So let me come back to the not to the Dominican Republic rather, but let me go to Mr. Rico very quickly. I'd love to talk about information and access to information and how this enables us to access even more social protection. Because if we think about the development of the universal pension scheme in Mexico, how that has been an opportunity for many people who were previously excluded to access for the very first time social protection. Do you think that based on this first entry point, that other social protection benefits, whether it's healthcare, childcare, unemployment, etc., could now be made available to those workers, especially those in the informal economy and their families?
Yes, in Mexico, we see this universal pension. Speaker's gone off mic. Could the speaker please put his microphone on?
Tim, can we have assistance on this mic? Please go ahead. I think it's working now.
Yes, it's working. Thank you. As I was saying, in Mexico, we see universal non-contributory pension for adult people as an access door to other types of services in an integral, comprehensive way. The universal pension, which we are providing, is an economic transfer, which includes an issue of inequality. The great inequality exists in Mexico. It establishes a minimum line of well-being with the economic transfers that we have month by month to people who are adult and of age. And this transfer is not the solution. However, transfer, we see it as a beginning just to establish the basis for equality or equity. And from there, from a more comprehensive perspective, a system, integral system, comprehensive system to provide care to all the groups who are socially disadvantaged or vulnerable. And that is the case of these adult of age people. And this is where we're going with the well-being policy. We're moving towards a national care system, which also has to deal with children. In Mexico, there isn't a universal child care system either. It's partial, one-sided, it's very small, but we're looking at the possibility of establishing a national care system, which first disseminates and establishes the right to receive care, and secondly, which will enable, of course, the women. They are the most affected sector because of lack of this care system. So they're the ones who are in Mexico. It's the women who take care of children, and they cannot work. Or small children are taken care of by their older siblings, or the girls take care of the adult of age people. And then also women are the ones that take care of people who have some kind of disability. So we're looking towards a national care system, which provides comprehensive care to all the people who receive a pension in Mexico.
So a trajectory into the future, which is building on what has been already achieved today. So I'm going to take an executive decision, and I'm going to take my questions, and I'm going to put them aside, and I'm going to allow your voice to come into this conversation, because I've got quite a strong set of, a very heavy set of questions, which says to me that the audience has something to say. So let's hear from the audience through some of the questions that they have shared with us. All right, so Madame Chatterjee, there's a question directly for you, and this question comes from Olga from Russia. And Olga is saying, we would like to ask about your experience and legislation in your country concerning the expansion of social guarantees to certain categories of the population, especially, example, freelancers, the self-employed, and those that are remotely employed. Again, we're going to this new ways of working and thinking about. So I'd like you to think about that question as I move on to another question, and then we'll get a comprehensive response. All right. This question comes from Sarah from Belgium, and the question is, how can we make sure that worker rights are implemented for people who are genuinely who genuinely or not own account workers beyond social protection? How can we value the invisible care work of women in society? So it's a question focusing on care work. How do we value care work for women in society? All right, so maybe, Madame Prialé, I'll ask you to answer that question. How do we begin to value what's invisible, care work? Because for the longest part, care work hasn't been valued. So how do we provide social protection in that regard? And I think this one is for you, Madame Mbaka. This is a question that comes from Gabriela from Argentina. And Gabriela says, how are cash transfer policies and care policies interlinked? Cash transfer. So as you can see, the questions from the audience are much harder than the questions that I've been asking here on the podium, but these are brilliant questions. So it's from Gabriela, how are cash transfer policies and care policies interlinked? Then we come to a very interesting question, and maybe Mr. Rico, this one is for you. This one comes from somebody called Rico Harima, representing the Mekong region, which is Cambodia, Myanmar, Thailand, Laos, and Vietnam. And this is a very strong question. It says, the majority of migrant workers in Asia are considered temporary labor force workers and are often excluded. And this faces causes a very serious barrier to receiving social protection. What are the strategies that we can think of to improve social protection coverage for migrant workers, which I think is a brilliant question that we haven't really touched on in this particular conversation. Mr. Oumarou, this one's for you. This question comes from Jean-Dominique Jacquemart. And Jean-Dominique is from Switzerland. And Jean-Dominique says, we are aware of ILO labor standards, but what about Bretton Woods institutions? How do they position themselves to those standards? And what resources do they make available for these and other analytical tools do they provide for governments? Right? So, yes, we see the ILO, but what about Bretton Woods institutions? And I think the question's put to you because we've heard this morning that there are partnerships and collaborations with other regional and international organizations. All right, so I'm going to find one last question, the one that I'm going to bring to you, Madame Jiménez, and the question is, this is a brilliant question, ladies and gentlemen. It comes from Manuel Martinez from the Dominican Republic, and the question is, can we ensure social protection for all without paying attention to stateless persons? Okay. What about stateless persons that don't have nationalities and cannot be assigned to specific countries? Now, ladies and gentlemen, I must tell you, I thought I had the best questions, but clearly you should be the one sitting here on stage because these questions are absolutely brilliant. So I'm going to work my way from Madame Chatterjee all the way down. We have on the clock 7 minutes. I'm going to take an executive decision again, and I'm going to extend that to 12 minutes, which gives you each just 2 minutes to respond to the question that has come from the floor. So, Madame Chatterjee, let's allow you to respond.
Sure. Thank you very much for the question. Very good question. I think one issue that has been a huge problem for us in India is what we call the conceptual issues. Our policymakers and legislators have not designed social protection policies and laws through the lens of informal workers, and we would argue particularly women. The lens that they have used is an employer-employee relationship lens, which comes from Industrial Revolution Europe, and that is not relevant to our world of work. So that's the first set of things I want to say. The second set of things is that we have really struggled with implementation. So like the Dominican Republic, we have a law since 2008. In fact, thousands of informal workers, including our trade union, marched on the streets of New Delhi to Parliament and got the law. And then, like you, we were rather disappointed because it has remained what we call a toothless tiger. It's remained there on paper, but it is not implemented because the implementation and operational issues were not thought of carefully at the time. So there was a big lesson in that for us. The third set of issues is the monitoring. Of course, in a country of 1.2 billion people, where 500 million are in the informal economy at least, the mind boggles how to monitor social protection. But monitor it we have to do, and in a decentralized way. So to answer your question, we do have social security legislation since 2008, but very poor implementation. The implementation has been through a series of fragmented schemes which are not universal, which divide workers into above poverty line, below poverty line, which is not helpful, and lots of inclusion and exclusion errors. And I think what we've learned from the experience is that if informal workers, unions, and cooperatives themselves do not sit across the table with policymakers and design bottom-up, design simple social protection, then we're left with schemes and laws and policies that remain on paper. The other thing we've learned is rather than rushing into laws for social protection, maybe we test out certain ideas through policies, see what works, what doesn't, what could work on the ground, and then move towards legislation. Otherwise, it remains, as I said, a toothless tiger.
Thank you very much. So from dead pieces of paper to toothless tigers, what we are certain of is that we want policies that actually make a difference and that are effective. Madame Prialé, let me allow you to respond to this difficult question from Sarah about the invisible work and how do we give social protection to care work?
El problema del
The problem of invisible work, particularly related to homework or child care or things of that sort. In most of these cases, those 8 out of 10 cases, the person who takes care of these tasks is a woman. She often has to stop working, and once she's out of the labor market, an independent one, she has no health coverage, and she has no pension coverage either. So in the case of Peru and Latin America, we more or less estimated if we were to recognize the work of the carer, the GDP of each country would be approximately 20%. That would represent 20%. So it's a human group that contributes, and usually they enrich the sector. The question is very complicated. How to make it visible when the employment doesn't have remuneration, so it's not subject to social protection coverage. In Peru, we have been encouraging a project, which I'd like to share with you, which we call seed capital. Instead of giving a transferred condition to being poor, as of the 65 years of age, what we're doing and trying to foster, and let's hope it will be a topic for discussion, is that each person, when he or she is born, is entitled to social protection coverage, and therefore has an account that gives them health coverage and pension coverage. And if that money were to be capitalized in time, 30 or 40 years, it should entitle people to minimal pension of universal nature. And in this way, we could make the employment of these people visible. Right now, it's not visible through the social protection coverage. So we should try to find out different outcomes, think out of the box, where we can make the contributions of people more visible and build new stools, like the seed capital, which is a lot less costly for the state. In the case of Peru, it's estimated that less than 0.15% of the GDP. And the second is that it's a universal pension equal for all, irrespective of whatever work you might have, the income you might have. And since we're considering the issue of floors, which is the very basis of social protection.
Very much. Thank you very much. Innovative example that you've shared with us, and I hope that, Sarah, that answers your question. It reminds me of a very quick example that I want to share. 2 years ago, I was in this very room on a stage, and we were debating care work, and somebody in the audience put up their hand and said, "I do not have a question, I have a comment." And this person said, "Until we start paying for care work, men will never participate." And so 2 years later, we're back in this room having the same conversation. Certain pieces of work are invisible because we don't pay for that certain piece of work. So thank you very much for that particular reminder. Madam Mbaka, the question to you, cash transfer policies and care policies, what is the link between the two? Question from Gabriela.
Thank you, Gabriela. I think, I'm sorry I have to disappoint Gabriela. As a country, we do not have a care policy. The issue of using caregivers to assist older persons is actually a design issue. But I think this is a very important question for us, because what it is telling us is that we need to look for linkages between the various policies on cash transfers and care, like the family policy, the social protection policy. We need to see how they all interlink so that they are speaking to each other. Thank you.
Thank you very much. So again, work in progress, and it's a brilliant question because it surfaces additional insight for us. Mr. Oumarou, I'm going to allow you to speak last. So I'm going to skip you for now, and I'm going to come to Mr. Rico to answer the question that came to us about what about migrant workers who are often considered temporary labor force. Your thoughts on that, sir?
Yes. I'm going to speak once again about the Mexican case. I do identify 3 elements, however, which are very important to understand the issue of migrant work. In Mexico, we have a country of high inflow of net flow of migrant people. We are a dual country, reception of migrants as well as expulsion of migrants. So we have a bit of experience in this topic. There are 3 topics here, or even 3 elements, which are important to analyze this topic. And the formalization of work, number 1. Often many migrants do not have regularization of their migrant status, so it makes their labor status very difficult. And then some system of social security or social protection is difficult too. Then secondly, legislation, in the case of legislation of Mexican migration law, there is no figure really, or the case for migrants who arrive in a temporary manner to come and work. That figure is very limited. Now we're implementing a strategy to take care of all the Central Americans and extracontinental migrants on the southern area. And we realized that we need to amend the law. In what way? How can we extend the different range of concepts that you have for a migrant person? And I'm going to talk a bit about how in Mexico we're taking care of the southern border. If we implement a strategy, and I'm going to be very brief, we implemented it into care for migrant people because we have about 25 million migrants in the southern border near Central America. That was to extend their temporary employment status. They work from 3 to 6 months. 3 to 6 months with a payment given to them by the government of Mexico. And during this period, we provide them with health, education, services which all the Mexicans are entitled to receive. During those 3 to 6 months, we're waiting for them to formalize or regulate their migratory status. And once those 6 months are up, then we look for employment for them basis of a census which they are carrying out, or study carrying out, to identify their labor capacities. That's the case of people who want to stay in the country. We know there's a lot of transit migration from Mexico, which goes to the United States and Canada. That's a completely different situation, much more difficult to supervise because of the conditions which these migrant people are. But the case of people, migrants, who come with a need to work or the desire to maintain, or they're leaving their country because of security issues or poverty issues, there we can create mechanisms of care to provide them social protection systems. And I think that these 3 elements are the main elements: the formalization of work. Otherwise, it's very difficult to integrate them into social security mechanisms unless they're universal pensions, legislation, amend the legislation in the case of Mexico, and the migratory policy is also very important.
Thank you very much. And again, I think what you've done, Mr. Rico, is you've reminded us the importance of contextualizing the experience for each and every country. Thank you for that. So we move from migrant workers to stateless persons. So how do we deal with this, Madam? No problem.
Bueno,
Perhaps the question has made me a little nervous, so I dropped the microphone. Right. First of all, the question that's just been made led to a query. From my point of view, the first thing we have to say, it would be a question addressed to the government, not to the trade unionists, and I'm a trade union member. However, I am going to give you the answer from the trade union point of view. A few months ago, the country just reviewed a national regulation plan in which trade unions, we were involved and mobilizing, supporting, motivating thousands of workers, particularly from the Haiti, from next door. They're our brothers and sisters, and we have the same island which we share. You can tell you that 240,000 people were registered in that plan, a plan which is not yet conclusive because of a whole set of factors, which include the trade unions. I can tell you, bear witness of what we're doing. How, as a trade union, what we're doing, how we can support these workers without looking into their conditions and family, but looking into it. So from Amusol, we have about 3,000 workers formalized, as Mexico said, because the law does not enable us to have a worker who doesn't have any documents and to register him. The first thing we have to do is provide them with documents, and that's where we're supporting them. The last experience that I wanted to point out here is how life has changed for these workers, particularly domestic workers. We have a huge number of domestic workers who are migrants, the sisters from Haiti who have benefited from this regulation plan and therefore can be registered with Social Security. How life has changed from that worker, from male or female, as far as the family is concerned. I agree that social protection is an investment. I agree. And whoever knows about this situation can hear the experiences of these workers whose lives have been changed. They can say, well, it's worthwhile investing in social protection as an investment, not as a cost, expense.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much. Unfortunately, Madam, I'm really out of time. I've just gotten...
Microphone, please.
Of some of our countries has been that if you give an identity card with biometric enabled, that helps portability for social protection.
Yes, thank you very much for your addition. I do apologize that we are tight for time, but thank you. It's an important part that you've raised. Mr. Oumarou, I'm going to allow you to just make your final comment, but of course to respond to the question on the Bretton Woods institutions. And as you respond to it, may you also just share with us, we shared some very big stats at the beginning. We said 4 billion people today are still without any form of protection. How are we going to close this gap as a way of closing off the conversation?
Merci, Madame.
Thank you, Mrs. Moderator. I just wanted to say that I'll begin with the question that has come from the public, from the audience. I think of the Swiss representative bench, to say that the ILO and the financial and international financial institutions, particularly the Bretton Woods institutions, we are partners and holding a discussion. Partners. What happens sometimes is that we have different ways of approaching issues, a way in which we treat things, and a way in which we manage things. This happens. And when that happens, we express our point of view amongst partners. And we end up with reports and approaches so as to do this. Sometimes the country approaches. The Bretton Woods institution insists that we go in one heading. And then we receive from our constituents from those countries, we receive requests to say, what do you advise us to do? What are you telling us? What can you make available to us as an argument, but also as data, so that we can successfully undertake discussions we have on social protection, on the reform of pensions, for example, with the financial international institutions, that is the Bretton Woods institutions. This happens. We do this amongst partners. The fact that sometimes we have approaches and different readings of the situation, approaches regarding management of the cases, the files and problems, sometimes different readings of what should be done, different opinions. This does not make us less a partner. And amongst partners, we manage these differences. We're making headway, particularly because there's essential importance in ensuring consistency as regards the multilateralism that we have nowadays. So this is why with these regular interviews or relationships in the case of different fora. That's what I want to say about that. And I don't think I can say more than that on that issue. But basically, we're partners. Now, regarding the question that you've just raised, and even before that question, and then that is a connection with what I said previously, is to remind you of what I said when in my introductory comments. That is the importance for us as an organization to have social dialogue. Today, if you look at information of what is happening throughout the world and in certain countries specifically, sometimes the situation which is being witnessed is a situation linked to a reform of one party or social protection aspects, which means that today we have situations which are almost the riotous kinds of situations in countries. And I insist on the fact that for social protection and anything that concerns social issues, it is important to have social dialogue. It's social dialogue which sees to it that when we reach a consensus, that consensus is respected. And we can even implement the policies and strategies which we would like to have, and even the reforms which we're envisioning to set up. It's social dialogues which will enable us to have the necessary resourcefulness to be able to identify the best approaches and the optimum strategies to be able to ensure social protection for all. Now, how do we do this? How are we able to cover this gap, if I can put it this way, this gap in social protection that we observe at a worldwide level? That comes back to saying, and everyone is used to this in the room, we need a political readiness, political willingness, a crystal clear one. As we said, the political willingness helps us to move mountains. And secondly, coming from political willingness, it's important that we can ensure then the financing. What financing should we have so that a sustainable financing can ensure social protection and to be able to finance social protection as a whole? And perhaps I should have started with that. And perhaps today, if you like, we have to fill this gap, this coverage gap of social protection. And this should be done through social protection floors. And you know this very well here, that the ILO is the only organization in the United Nations systems which has an instrument concerning these social protection floors. So all these elements enable us to make us make headway in our effort so that we can all see to it that social protection be a social protection which is universal. And these are the elements I wanted to raise here. And I also like to remind you here of the importance of social dialogue, one. And secondly, the political desire or readiness or willingness, which is a strong political desire. And with this, we can move mountains. I repeat it.
Thank you very much. And so, ladies and gentlemen, I think the points have been made. If we're going to move mountains, it starts with social dialogue, and it also moves to increased investments. Tomorrow morning, one of the first session that we're going to be looking at actually speaks to increased investments that are required for universal social protection the world over. Now, what I have in my hand is the entirety of all the questions that you've asked. We can't address these questions right now, but this is absolutely critical data that the team is going to be sitting with very seriously as they think about the outcome document, because this is a reflection of the conversations that we should be having and the questions that are still unanswered despite the conversations that we've been having. So thank you very much for these. I'm going to hold on to these and pass them on to the team. What I would love for us to do is to first give a big round of applause to our panelists for a stellar contribution. Thank you, thank you. Thank you very much for a stellar contribution. Let's take a quick coffee break. We have run out of time because of your amazing questions, and so I'm going to ask us to literally step out, grab a cup of coffee, and make our way back in. We're going to be starting at 15:45, which is in about 12 minutes from now. I'll see you shortly, 15:45, for the next panel, which is the final panel for the day. Thank you so much.
Thank you.